Good afternoon, everyone. So today is the last day of our presentation season two. On the last day of presentation season two, I'm going to present my presentation on World War and its influence on literature and films. So let's start with the presentation. This is my personal information. Table of content, studying war, the literature of war in literature, how World War first changed literature, how World War second, here is a mistake, how World War first or second in the films and books, which is based on World Wars. Studying was the PMLA. So this is a publication, the publication of Modern Language Association, the major association of professor of English, has called for papers on new direction in literary criticism for the 20th century. In a World War II era poem of modern poetry, Walt Stephen declared that among other things, modern poetry has to think about wars. In a similar fashion, as the Iraq War grinds on now into its sixth year, and it has become painfully obvious that despite some wishful thinking in the wake of Vietnam, American ground wars are hardly a thing of the past. So, in the modern poetry, Walt Stephen declare about things that modern poetry should, or modern poet should think about war poetries. We know why the subject of war and the military have fallen out of favors, and why most professors in English as well as history prefers to oppose war and criticize the military rather than to study them. The Vietnam War changed the meaning of war and of the military in this country. At least on the left, and the cohort of professors that for the most part has dominated and set trends in this field in the last 20 years. So this country means America. This In the country, in this point, this writer talk about the Vietnam War and America, history of America and wars. The American experience in World War First by English professors in now beginning to be broken, most notably with Richard Slotkin's 2005 Lost Battalions. So this is the work by Richard Solkins, The Great Wars and the Crisis of American Nationality. So in this work, he is talking about how World War affect the history and how World War influenced the writers of that time to write about war genres. The literature of wars, as long as there has been wars, there have been writers trying to understand it, turning battlefield's horror into a narrative, trying to make something useful out it's debris. So there are many writers who write about wars, and from Stephen Krantz, the Red Badge of Courage, which has remains in print since its publication in 1895. So this is a work by Stephen Krantz, and Ernest Hemingway's most famous work on war, Farewell of Arms, a book that dramatized the author's youthful experience during World War First. So we all know about the Ernest Hemingway's journalism, and he was also a part of war in World War First, and also he was part of World War Two. So in this work also he write about his experience of wars. Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, the Vietnam War novel that was finalized for the Pulitzer Prize, and the National Critical Circle Award in 1990. War has inspired some of the best known works in the American canon. Today, our war literature is no less vivid and troubling, even if it is less grand in the themes and less demure in detail. So, also we know that Hollywood and Bollywood both have these things in. They are exploring more about war genres. Like we have these patriotic movies and patriotic songs and poems. So the war themes are very explored by the writers and filmmakers. This is a quotation by Ernest Hemingway in his work Men at War. There was no really good true war books during the entire 4 years of the war. The only true writing that came through during the war was in the poetry. One reason for this is poets are not arrested as quickly as prose writers. So, in this quote, you can see that the prose writers are more arrested by the armies. Like when they were writing about war, they were arrested, and also their books were also burned. And this history, we all know that war has a very dark history. Like their writers writing things and manuscripts were burnt by the government and militaries. So in this work also he write about a man who was a part of battle and who was a part of wars. British literature after World War II. World War II ended in 1945. We know that started in 1939 and ended in 1945, and its conclusion marked an important shift in Great Britain's global rule. For the first time, Britain was a secondary imperial power, something that was painful for many British citizens. The expectations after the war were that the economy would again rise, but inflation and unemployment lead to be an overall increase in national cynicism. Postmodernism found most of its success in American and was difficult to identify in England, as many modernist writers continued to write well into the 1940s and 50s. So we know that this modernism and postmodernism, this both writers were writing about wars, and after World War also they are exploring the genre of wars. War in literature, there are many other writers of 20th and 21st century that are still writing novels today. It is difficult to predict what will be popular in future, but it is clear that literature reflects the history of its time. The literature of war takes a widely varieties of approaches in its efforts to comprehend the war experience and encompass a scholarship on a number of genres, including poetry, dramas, short stories, novels, journals, diaries, oral historians, memories, and letters all have war genre. While early scholarship focused most fully on a white male soldiers, it has gradually evolves to include genders and minority studies, trauma studies, bipolar studies, the effect of war. So this all are including these things in a war writers. The 11th September 2001 attack on the World Trade Center in New York City, as well as other acts of terrorism around the globe, have results in a new body of literature that consider the war on a terror. How World War changed the literature. While both Brooks and Mackerens, these both are the famous war poets or writers, lent patriotic tones to the sacrifices of war. Early in the conflict, as this time, war on the war's restlessness, horrors, spavots, and darkness in reflections. Some, like English poet Wilfred Owen, shows it their duty to reflect the grim reality of the war in their works. So, this is a quotation by Wilfred Owen. I quote: all the poet today can do is warn. That is why the true poet must be truthful. I unquote. In Anthem for the Doomed Youth, Owen described soldiers who die as a skeleton and the monstrous anger and the guns. So this is a quote by Owens, and Wilfred Owen is very famous poet of war. World War First, the war that was originally expected to be over by Christmas, dragged on the 4/4 with a grimed brutality brought on by the dawn of French World War. A writer then suddenly, like a cave in the smooth road, the war came. So this is a horror of war and trauma of war. How literature and other writers are influenced and traumatized by the wars. Literature and cinema. The impact of cinema on early 20th century literary and moral broadly culturally consciousness has until recently been neglected. Yet to be looked back at the period is it find that film consciousness was everywhere. In 1928, Kenneth McFreeze, co-editor of the avant-garde film genre, Close Up Right, the cinema has become so much a habit of thought and word and deed as to make it impossible to visualize modern consciousness without it. In the same year, the poet H.D. Hilda Doolittle, a fellow contributor to Close Up, claimed that the world of the film today is no longer the world of the film. It is the world there has never been, perhaps, since the days of the Italian Renaissance, so great a stirring in the mind and soul of the world consciousness. She was writing her about Russian films, but the promise of cinema was its internationalism, its creation of a visual language that transcended culture and linguistic differences. And that for HD, Hilda Doolittle, as for many other early films, enthusiasts did not survive the transition to sound in the late 1920s and early 30s. World War First in films. Filmmaking became part of World War making through documentary films, newsreels, and film narratives produced by governments or by private films companies. So during the after World War and during the World War, there are so many documentaries which were made by the governments on other film private companies were made on wars. Uh, there in the films, they used genre combined films, propaganda films, and anti-war films, and also they were focusing on the gender and historical documents. So some film scholars look at historical accuracy to assess other looks at the war film primarily as the metaphor. So they will also use the war as a metaphor. Cinematic fiction, the impact of the cinema on the American novel up to World War II. So this is a book. Uh, this book examines American cinematic classes and also looks at some lesser known figures such as Carl Van Mentens and Tom Cromer. The phrase cinematic fiction has now been generally accepted into critical disorder, but is usually applied to the post war novels. The book asks a simple question. Given their fascination with the new medium of film, did American novelists attempt to apply cinematic method in their own writing? This is a question which are asked by the writer. From its very beginning, the cinema has played a special role in defining American culture. Covering the period from the 1910s up to the Second World War, the book offers insight into the classical, such as The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald and The Grapes of Wrath, discussing major writers' critical writing on the films and active participation in filmmaking. It is carefully not to portray cinema as a single of stable entry. So some novelists drew on a silent film, other looks to the Russian theorists for the inspiration, and yet other turns to continual filmmaker rather than to Hollywood. So films were very good medium to understand wars as a genre, and also films were a medium to explore the war genre into the today's time. Man, War and Film. This is also a book by Stavely House. Is an artistic filmmaker whose work has been screened worldwide and has collaborated closely with the Northwest Film Archive UK. He is Empress Professor at the Manchester University, UK. Howley's book is part of description of the films, part reclamation of a largely unknown genre of war times, filmmaking partly an account of the Burma camping, and partly a discussion of war and memories. The Calling Blinky series of films. This is a series of films. In that series, also they were talking about wars. By the combined kinematography service produced towards the end of the Second World War, were on one reel films in which soldiers gave short spoken message to the camera as a means of connection the front line and the home front. So in the this series of films, the soldiers who are part of World War First and Second, they were giving the message to the other people or normal citizen, like what happened in the war and what they experienced in the war, and what's the situation of their in the war, and also their mindset, and how they were feel they are far away from their home, and how they feel in the war. So this is a screenshot of ChatGPT, which is giving a good explanation about my presentation's topic. I cannot include this whole all topics in one presentation, like realism and modernism, other topics like psychological trauma, propaganda, post-war recovery. So all these points were given by ChatGPT. These are works cited. Now you can ask me a question. Thank you.
Drashti, how did the trauma of the World War One and World War Two impact the artistic styles and the techniques of the writer and the filmmaker?
We all know that these world wars are very traumatic for everyone, like who is part of that and who were not a part of them. But also, this is also very influential. This have impact on the artistic style and artists and also filmmakers, they were exploring the things of the psychological trauma, and also surrealism image and symbolism of the world wars, and also they were using the psychology of the soldiers, and they were using these things of the soldiers and their experience into their films, and also into their poems and works. So this is very we can say the very important to note that world wars have a very best or bad both impact on the filmmakers and writers.
Drashti, my question is how has the influence of World War on literature and films affected popular culture and society as a whole?
This, as I also mentioned in my presentation, like writers are using this technique or genre to explain about how the soldiers and they were in back 1920s or in the World War First or in the World War Second, they were using this things and emotionally connected with the other people. So they were using this. Artists or the filmmakers using this popular culture and societal views on the soldiers or a war. Like they were also making the genres like anti-war things. So this is things which are included in my presentation also, and I hope you are understand and you are satisfied with my answer. Thank you.